In terms of video games, a spiritual successor is a game that has been largely inspired by an existing game. Essentially, these games do not take place in the same universe, have the same characters, weapons, etc. as the games they are inspired by. However, try to copy the same tone, themes, gameplay, and similar narrative techniques that were present in these games, whilst putting their own twist on the formula. The development teams who make spiritual successors tend to be made up of ex-employees from another company who left that company due to personal reasons or creative differences. Now, of course, like any game, spiritual successors vary in quality. You get the good ones that not only reach the quality of what they were inspired by, but completely surpass it and develop a huge following and get recognised as a great franchise for their own merits. Then you get the ones that try too hard to be what they were inspired by and end up feeling like cheap copies. Then comes just the worst kind of spiritual successor. We call this tier of spiritual successor Mighty Number 9. Thankfully, I'm not here to talk about this monstrosity. I'm here to talk about the Callisto Protocol, a spiritual successor to the Dead Space franchise that was created by the man who brought that franchise to life all the way back in 2008, Glenn Schofield, now with his brand new development team, Striking Distance Studios. Dead Space was one of the first video games to show us just how truly horrifying the sci-fi genre can be. Ah, that alien from Pikmin's pretty cute. Well, check this out, this one just ripped your head off and is now piloting your body. The original Dead Space, without a doubt, is one of the best horror games to ever be released, thanks to its gruesome creature designs, ingenious sound design, as well as its excellent use of suspense that keeps you second guessing what will happen next. Dead Space 2 was praised for keeping up these high standards, as well as adding more to the lore of the universe, and giving Isaac more charm and personality, and Dead Space 3 was praised for... actually, what was Dead Space 3 praised for? Most people saw 3 as the final nail in the coffin for the franchise, as it proved that EA had lost the vision of what made the first 2 games masterpieces. For years, it seemed like we weren't going to get anything Dead Space related ever again, but after seeing that trailer for the Callisto Protocol, I was instantly hooked. For me, it perfectly captured the essence of Dead Space, the fear of the unknown, as we see the character locked inside a claustrophobic room, unaware of what is going on, followed with unseen enemies scuttling in the darkness. And then all of this suspense is beautifully executed, with a disgusting monster giving our protagonist a nice big kiss. All this combined with the fact that Glenn Schofield was at the helm once again made every gamer believe that this was the Dead Space game we had been waiting for so many years. Of course, then the Dead Space remake was teased about half a year later, and whilst I am looking forward to it, there's just something more special about a game that we don't know anything about. It seems impossible for EA to make the original Dead Space better because the game was so good to begin with, but with the Callisto Protocol, we had no idea if it would be worthy of being considered a successor to Dead Space. So is it? Well, that's hard to say. The Callisto Protocol in many ways succeeded my expectations. Now maybe that's due to the fact that games nowadays suck, so I have to dial back my excitement, but I found myself genuinely enjoying the game. This game has a lot to love and appreciate, and Glenn Schofield and his team should be commended for delivering an effective survival horror experience, even if it isn't entirely original. But hey, this guy created Dead Space, so surely he gets a pass. Having said that, there were some clear issues that, like a hallucination of a deceased loved one, kept whispering to me throughout my time playing, constantly reminding me that they were there, which meant by the end I found myself not enjoying the game as much as I would have liked. To make my final decision on the game, I need to pick it apart and find out exactly what works and what doesn't. Our story takes place in a brand new universe that's not too different from our own. The first cutscene gives us a good indication of the tone right off the bat and introduces a lot of the points that will be important in the future. What is this place? What's happened to these people? Who is she? And why is the game stuttering? A big problem faced by anyone who has played the game on PC is that there are many instances where the game would stutter. The game has since been patched, but on launch day, needless to say, this was very distracting and made it difficult to get immersed in the story when the game would constantly stop and start during cutscenes or when there was a major change in the environment. The cutscene after this one then cuts to Jacob Lee, the protagonist of the game. Jacob is a seasoned cargo transporter. You may have noticed that he's played by Josh Duhamel, whose last video game credit was in COD World War II, but most people of culture will know him as William Lennox. Nowadays, it seems like more and more video games have famous actors in their rosters, especially if motion capture is a part of the game, and the Callisto Protocol has quite the star-studded cast. Of course, I've already mentioned Josh, but there's also the likes of Karen Fukuhara, known for her role in the greatest DC film ever made, Jeff Shine, known for his work in Resident Evil games, and Sam Witwer, who I was especially looking forward to seeing in this game. Jacob and his buddy Max, played by Jeff Shine, run into a spot of bother with some space pirates, causing their ship to crash land, and one side of Max's face to turn into bolognese.
Jacob? Jacob?
I'm showing you how to make classic bolognese sauce.
The planet they crash on is Callisto, a frozen wasteland home to the most notorious prison in the galaxy, Black Iron Prison. After being arrested along with the surviving pirate Danny, played by Karen Fukuhara, Jacob is given a warm welcome by the warden of the prison, encouraging all new prisoners that their old lives have ended, but their new lives are just beginning. Jacob then gets escorted through the interior of the prison and sent to processing to have a small device drilled into the back of his neck. For me, this was a great setup for the setting of the game, as it clearly shows the brutality of how things work in this prison. The prisoners are essentially treated as cattle, stripped of their identity and branded to show who they belong to. Before Jacob can get a day of proper prison life, hanging out in the yard and making pasta sculptures, most of the guards and inmates start acting crazy, transforming into boil-covered mutants. Jacob soon realises that the prison has now become far more dangerous than he could have imagined, and if he wants to get out alive, he needs the help of fellow inmates and other unconventional allies. The story seems to be a big issue for a lot of people, as many have labelled it boring and unoriginal. I can see where they are coming from, as the game's story feels like it borrows a lot of inspiration from Dead Space 2, a super shady organisation wanting to evolve the human race by turning them into freaky monsters. It was a pretty cliched route to take with the story, but I feel like the narrative has some pretty strong elements to it. The performances from the actors were really strong all around, and most of them served useful and fulfilling purposes. Most of them. When we are first introduced to Jacob, he comes across as overconfident and arrogant, believing he is always right. As the game progresses, however, and Jacob has to put his trust into others, we see his more vulnerable side, as he learns to take responsibility for his past actions. Yes, it's revealed that Jacob is one of the reasons that caused Europa, the place we saw in the first cutscene, to become infected with the same virus that is loose on Callisto, which Jacob had transported there from Black Iron Prison. Jacob is a flawed character, which makes him relatable, to an extent. I'm not saying we've all been responsible for releasing a deadly virus onto an innocent population. Many of the supporting characters were also great additions to the story. One I feel that most people seem to be missing the importance of is Max. Max dies at the beginning of the game, so most people would just dismiss him as being used only for shock factor, but he plays a much bigger role over the course of the story. Once again taking inspiration from Dead Space 2, Max is essentially this game's Nicole, as there are instances throughout the game where Jacob interacts with a ghostly version of Max. However, rather than being a hallucination brought on by the marker, one of the side effects of the device in the back of his head is that it causes hallucinations from time to time, which gives Jacob his own embodied consciousness in the form of Max. Despite Jacob clearly knowing what he did wrong, he decides to push the memories down into the dark recesses of his mind, denying their very existence, but Max is there to remind him of his misdeeds, and it's these hallucinations that turn him into a less selfish and more heroic character. Jacob's character progression isn't the only reason these hallucinations are in the game. No, of course they are also used to scare you silly.
I have nothing to do with what happened on your own.
Elias is an inmate at Black Iron Prison who has been there for nearly half his life, which has allowed him to learn about the ins and outs of the prison. This makes him an invaluable ally to Jacob, which comes in handy as he is the first person you meet at Black Iron after the outbreak occurs. Elias acts as your guide for the first half of the game, telling you where to go and what to do next. He sets you on your way with his very own homemade shank. Of course, the British guy is the one with the knife. The devs then decided that they needed to have a mid-game sad moment, which means Elias is killed off, and so you are forced to team up with your old pal Danny the space pirate. Danny is very agitated by Jacob, and her motives at the beginning of the game remain unclear until you realise that it's kind of Jacob's fault that her little sister dies. Luckily for Jacob, he manages to win her over after he says, "Oopsie daisy." It was interesting to see the relationship between these two grow out of desperation for survival, and it was interesting to see Jacob repay Danny's forgiveness by sacrificing himself at the end of the game. Oh wait, no, sorry, he got saved by the powers of the DLC expansion. The other characters in the game were serviceable at best. The Warden has little to no screen time in the game, making his inclusion feel pointless, but the biggest wasted opportunity in this game for me, in terms of story, was Sam Witwer's character, Captain Ferris. Sam Witwer crushes it in any role he takes on. He is known for taking Darth Maul, an arguably underutilized character many years ago, and turning him into one of the greatest Star Wars characters ever created, and he could have been a great antagonist for this game, but Striking Distance just didn't know how to use him. In his introduction, he comes comes across as cold and cunning, loving his job despite it literally involving bringing people into one of the most cruel prisons to exist, guilty or not. After he falls from a guard tower, you don't see him for most of the game until he finally appears, showing us that he has succumbed to the infection spreading across the prison. However, something is different about him. All the infected you have encountered are animalistic and are unable to speak, driven only by the desire to kill you and anyone else still alive in the prison. But Ferris shows clear signs that his memory is still intact. This makes you believe that Ferris will be the main antagonist of the game, stalking the player and being one of the hardest challenges to beat in the game, but in reality, he's one of the easiest. In total, you fight Ferris 2 times, and both times are some of the easiest moments of gameplay in the entire game. As expected, the gameplay mechanics of the Callisto Protocol and Dead Space are very similar, but that's not to say that there aren't any new additions to the formula. The Callisto Protocol feels like a slower experience, with combat feeling a lot more intimate, as rather than having you face tons of monsters at once, you only ever really face 1 or 2, or small groups. Despite this sounding easier, it is far from easier, as enemies are noticeably a lot tougher to kill than they were in Dead Space. Guns take up most of your arsenal, ranging from handheld pistols to rifles. The most important weapon you have that most of the other gameplay mechanics revolve around is the electrified baton. Melee combat is what you will be doing most of the time, as guns are there more so as support to finish enemies off and weaken them from a distance. The Callisto Protocol's combat is very similar to hack and slash games, as it revolves around comboing your enemies, as well as dodging and blocking enemy attacks. This mechanic was intriguing at first, as it meant that you had to fight most of your enemies face to face, which is made all the more terrifying given how strong most of them are. It was also a great way to further itself from Dead Space, seeing as the combat from those games heavily revolves around projectiles and keeping your distance from the necromorphs. Despite this, I can't help but feel some of these new renditions and additions were not put through quality control. The combat controls for this game at times feel really unresponsive, and despite me holding down A or D to dodge, Jacob would just stand there like a lemon and take the punishment. This is made even more frustrating when multiple enemies are around you, as sometimes you get forced to fight the closest enemy in your sights, making it difficult to turn around and fight any enemies that are having a cheeky go from behind you. The gun mechanic also has a lot of issues too, as instead of being able to swap weapons quickly, you have to dismantle a part of your gun in order to slot another base into the trigger. This is the most unnecessarily tedious mechanic in the game, and it's incredibly unresponsive when you are in combat, as getting hit or aiming mid-animation causes the entire progress to restart, so good luck if you need to reload or swap weapons mid-fight. This makes another mechanic involving the enemies 10 times worse than it should have been, which is the evolving mechanic. When doing enough damage to an enemy, there is a chance of them sprouting tentacles from their stomach. Failing to shoot these in a short period of time will allow the enemy to further mutate into a larger, more deadly enemy, and because of how broken the gun mechanic is, a lot more enemies tend to mutate than you'd like. This mechanic is somewhat of a throwback to Dead Space, shown by the message on the wall, though I've got to admit, shoot the tentacles isn't as memorable as cut off the limbs. A welcomed inclusion to the gameplay was the stealth mechanic. Stealth is a great tool at heightening the fear in the player as they quietly and methodically navigate themselves out of danger, whilst the pressure is building as they are pursued by enemies, although not perfectly executed, as striking distance thought that having the player sneak past about 20 enemies is fair. My favourite stealth segments involved hiding from the security bots, just for the sole fact that if you got spotted, you were instantly obliterated. I just wish there was more segments in the game like this, as it was good downtime. The Callisto Protocol also includes your standard survival horror game mechanics. There is no auto healing in the game, and so you can only restore health by finding injectors that shoot Mountain Dew into your neck, or small packets of dew that restore a small portion of your health. This was an implementation I enjoyed because it gives the game a level of challenge and makes the experience much scarier. Item shops allow the player to purchase upgrades and ammo for their weapons, but in order to craft these items, you need Callisto credits. These can be found throughout the game in small cupboards, desks, and item boxes, along with ammo and healing items. Be careful when searching areas, however, as sometimes you might be greeted by a little unwanted friend. One of the things I really enjoyed about the gameplay of the Callisto Protocol is that there are plenty of places to explore, giving the game a semi-open world vibe. A big staple of Dead Space is the ability to manipulate the environment around you. Slowing enemies down and picking items up with stasis and telekinesis gave the combat a unique twist and allowed you to tackle enemies in multiple different ways. When it was revealed that Jacob would be receiving a similar tool to telekinesis, everyone was immediately excited by all the possible combat approaches you would be able to take, but honestly I found myself rarely using this tool. To begin with, telekinesis is incredibly weak. Despite being able to pick enemies up, it lasts for a very short period of time, so doing this will drain the battery unless you throw them instantly. Of course it can be upgraded to last longer and have a shorter cooldown, but there's no use relying on it too much. It seems like Striking Distance knew how weak this ability was, and to make it somewhat usable, they put spiked walls in certain areas of the game, which instantly kill enemies who are impaled by them. I can deal with a little bit of lag during cutscenes, but when some of the mechanics are just flat out annoying, then I can't ignore it. It feels like Striking Distance put these gimmicks in for the sake of having gimmicks, without them having any real benefit to the player. In Dead Space, everything felt necessary, and whilst the game was challenging, the player was given tools to help them, but in the Callisto Protocol, it feels like the tools are there to make it harder for you, which just isn't fun. If Glenn Schofield knows one thing, it's how to create a creepy setting with nothing but sound. Sound was so important in Dead Space as it was arguably the main source of the scares, the far-off echoing roars of unseen beasts, to the haunting whispers interrupting your train of thought as you navigate quiet parts of the Ishimura, really made your imagination run wild with what horrors could be waiting for you in the next room. As well as offering scares, there was also something very satisfying about a lot of the sounds. Each weapon sounded hard and impactful, and whilst the sound of dismembering necromorphs was unsettling, it was oddly satisfying. The Callisto Protocol uses sound in a very similar way, as it is a major catalyst for the horror in the game. Each location in the game has unique sounds within them that help set them apart from previous and future locations in your journey. In Black Iron itself, there are a lot of sparking plugs, clanging metal, and falling debris, conveying a sense of anarchy, but as well as this you get the subtler sounds, such as the groans of destroyed security bots and the voiceover heard in the vending machines, reminding you that this place was once relatively normal. Then upon reaching the icy surface of Callisto, you are bombarded by a deafening wind that makes it difficult to hear anything else. Then you have the sounds found in the old colony. Like in Black Iron, there are noises of broken machinery and falling debris, but you notice that it's a lot quieter than the prison, and everything sounds a lot slower and rustier, highlighting the fact that this place has been out of commission for over 70 years. It's details like these that made me enjoy playing through these locations. Now I have to admit, one missed opportunity with the sound design is that there isn't really much in terms of haunting ambience or dialogue. Given the fact that Jacob's hallucinations get worse as the game goes on, it would have been cool to hear dialogue that didn't belong, such as more lines from Max, or maybe hearing Ferris when he wasn't there, which could have bumped up the creepy atmosphere. Given the Callisto Protocol's cinematic look and feel, it's no surprise that the developers decided to add audio stingers during especially creepy moments, just to make them that little bit scarier. The most disappointing sound design choice for me was the sounds created by your weapons. They just sound so generic and sound like standard guns. Unlike Dead Space, where the different sounds created by your weapons gave them their own personalities, in the Callisto Protocol the guns have about as much personality as a packet of ready salted crisps. The level design in this game for me is amazing. Black Iron itself is such a foreboding and menacing place to interact with, and the narrow walkways and tight corridors make for a very claustrophobic experience. The amount of deadly machinery you come across also reminds you that even before the infection was released, the prison was always a dangerous place. It's a great starting location to let the player get settled into the game, as it offers a vast range of different environments to help the player get used to how the game will play out, giving the player ample time to learn how to fight enemies in close quarters. The visual effects of the game are great too, such as the snow during the segment where you have to walk outside on Callisto's surface. But of course my attention was snatched away from all the stutter. I think one issue I had with the environments was that they weren't really used as a visual storytelling device. Dead Space was big on telling a story through the interior of the Ishimura, with crazed writing plastered throughout the halls of the ship, rooms decorated with candles as a sign of respect for those who have died, as well as tons of bodies littering every room, signifying a struggle. These small details got you invested in not just the main story, but also the stories of all the other people who lost their lives on board this ship. But with the Callisto Protocol, there isn't much in terms of this storytelling. There are some instances where this game tries to do this with its environments, moments, but it rarely feels like it's used to give insight into anything that has happened before Jacob has got to a certain area. There are those moments where the environment is used to show you specific things like how disgusting and dangerous the alien threat is, but you never really get insight into how other inmates feel about what is happening. The character designs in the game are passable, though I was disappointed by Jacob's suit, as it looks like something ripped straight out of Infinite Warfare, but it's the designs of the enemies that I'm most disappointed by. We all knew deep down that whatever designs for the enemies they came up with, none of them would be as iconic as the Necromorphs. There's just something about their shapes and structure that make them so incredibly unique. Each variant of Necromorph looks drastically different from the last, and these looks not only set them apart from each other, but they also allowed the developers to use them in creative ways. All of the enemy variants in the Callisto Protocol collectively are called biophage. Grunts are the most common of the enemies, and the ones who look the least mutated, having the appearance of zombie-like beings, with boils covering the exposed parts of their body. Their design pretty much describes what they are straight away. Unimportant. This is an issue that I found with a lot of the enemy designs in the game, as they just felt like things I'd already seen in video games before. They were just too humanoid in appearance, with their limbs showing little to no change from a typical human. The best designs in this game are the absolute weird ones. My favourite enemy design has to be the Bloodworm. As the name implies, they are a worm-like creature that lunges at the player and drags them into their den. The fact that they have a humanoid head and multiple tongue-like appendages lashing around in their mouth is incredibly unsettling. Rushers are also very creepy, as they run around on all fours as they stalk the player. Their body has become completely distorted, with their limbs becoming elongated and their spines shooting out of their back. The best enemy designs in the game are the ones that stay away from looking too human, which unfortunately is not very many designs. If Striking Distance wanted to push the game and give it a personality of its own, they needed to be more creative with the things you shoot at. Another aspect that made Dead Space so terrifying was how getting a game over wasn't as simple as just dying and quickly respawning, as you were forced to watch Isaac die in the most agonising ways. The Callisto Protocol thankfully doesn't sugarcoat death. If Jacob dies, you will know about it, as each enemy variety has unique kill animations that highlight their deadly capabilities. Again, this made you determined not to get killed by the monsters in the game, as it was pretty sickening to see half of your face get clawed off. After playing the Callisto Protocol, I can't wholeheartedly say that I loved or hated the game. It has its fair share of issues stemming from gameplay mechanics not being as fluid or coordinated as they could have been, and it seems like Striking Distance included gimmicks for the sake of the game being gimmicky. Instead of improving on what made Dead Space fun to play, it chose to change the wrong mechanics, and as a result, the game feels janky in certain areas. Having said that, the game still managed to deliver an effective and immersive survival horror experience, thanks to its eerie atmosphere and its amazing performances from the cast. With the announcement of DLC, I just hope that Striking Distance learns from their mistakes and rectifies them in the story expansion.